again, if you are working in gospel ministry, you're doing the most important work in the world. Like you're doing this work that's going to have eternal impact. There are literally souls who are in the balance. And with every day that goes by, governments and central banks are making that work more and more difficult to do. And they're taking away the purchasing power of this money.
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest.
Hey, what's up, guys? It's Oshawa Hawthorne here with Brilliance Labs.
Hey, Oshawa.
And I got my buddy Gabe.
Hello, how's it going?
Going well, Gabe. And we have a guest today. We're with Jordan Bush, who we're making an exception. Normally, we only talk to people from the Northwest. If you're coming from California, if you're anywhere like east of the Cascades, we're just not going to go there. We're very local, right? Homegrown is what we're about in the Northwest, but we're willing to make an exception because this is a special guest and friend. And maybe if you like us enough, we can do like a co-branded podcast with your podcast. You can decide afterwards how this turns out. But Jordan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Jordan Bush. I'm the executive director of TGFB Media. Again, which is it's a business that works to help the church, Big C Church, use and understand Bitcoin for the glory of God and the good of people everywhere. I will say I am not from the Pacific Northwest, but I am a fair trade podcast guest. So hopefully that buys me some credibility. You know, I was not brought here under any kind of abusive situations, and so hopefully that works for our Portland audience.
That's good. We only drink fair trade coffee.
That's right.
And fair trade beer, and
Amen.
Listen to fair trade podcasts.
Amen. Hallelujah.
This podcast was ethically produced.
Yeah.
Amen.
No podcasters were harmed in the creation.
Yes. So I actually wore my Bitcoin shirt for this event, and if you can tell, we have matching El Salvador Bitcoin Day posters because I have a side hobby of doing missions and Bitcoin stuff. But for someone that is like, that's out of left field, and they normally listen to this podcast because they care about church planting and kingdom work, why should they keep listening to this podcast? Give me the 60-second pitch to why a church leader should care about Bitcoin.
Yeah. Which I will be the first one to admit that sounds preposterous. It sounds ridiculous. I'll just kind of tell you my story. The reason why I think people should care has everything to do with kind of my, history of getting into Bitcoin. My wife and I got married knowing that we wanted to be missionaries and church planters. We were initially thinking that we were going to go to a jungle tribe with something like a New Tribes Missions or something like that. And in God's providence, he ended up sending us to an urban jungle. The pastor jokes will not improve. I promise. They're going to continue being just bad. But so we ended up moving to Montevideo, Uruguay, in South America, kind of in the armpit between Argentina and Brazil, a small country, one of the most secular places in the Western Hemisphere. And so we went there thinking that we were going to plant a church, and we were anticipating, again, ministering to a largely secular environment. Almost half the population would claim to be either atheist or agnostic, and practically a much higher percentage of the people who live there live that way. So we went there thinking that we were going to plant a church in that kind of environment. Once we arrived, we found that we were arriving at the same time as around 60,000 Venezuelan immigrants who were piling into the surrounding nations, Colombia, Brazil, Uruguay, some of these other places, as a result of the Venezuelan government hyperinflating their currency. They had made all kinds of promises. Politicians had made promises in order to get elected, and they promised free stuff. And so over time, that free stuff and the bill came due on more and more of that free stuff. And the way that the government handled it was to continue to print more and more currency. And so it got to the point over the course of a few years where we had people in our church who were doctors, economists, people making over $100,000 a year in dollar terms, who 3 or 4 years later couldn't even pay the rent. of a few $100s a month living in Uruguay. So they were forced to flee their country. In many cases, what we experienced were men who moved to Uruguay, moved to these other countries, left their wives and kids to try to get a job, save up some money, send home, and then also save up to be able to bring their families. So we saw all kinds of just infidelity. We saw, kids spending years without their parents. And so again, I just got to, without having any framework or any real education in macroeconomics and the ways that these things affect ministry and global ministry, I got to see firsthand, had a front row seat to, trying to minister to people who were in this in-between world. And so it was as we were ministering to them and just trying to help these people get started and, restart their lives in this new country as we ourselves were doing the same thing. I just started to kind of ask questions and try to understand why this was happening. And so again, I started to understand currency devaluation and kind of the post World War II macroeconomic landscape and how the United States dollar since 1944 had served as a global reserve currency. It was pegged to a certain number of or certain amount of gold. And everything worked that way. These other nations would peg their currency to gold. Gold was pegged their currency to the U.S. dollar. The dollar was pegged to gold, and everything was great until 1971, when one of those nations basically tried to convert some of their U.S. dollar reserves for gold. And the very next day, President Nixon, everyone's favorite president, came out and just basically said, "Hey, the United States is stopping the convertibility of gold. We're not for dollars. We're not going to do that anymore." And so that kind of threw the global landscape into a whirlwind, because at that point there was nothing backing these national currencies because there was nothing backing the dollar. So you really got to a situation. I came to understand that you had a situation where the currencies of all these different nations around the world were now only as strong as their governments were fiscally responsible. And if you know anything about governments, over time, again, this tendency of governments to want to fund, to want to say, "Let my kingdom come and let my will be done," and let me use this money to fund those endeavors, that just happens over time. And so in Venezuela, I found that this had happened in Venezuela 3 times before. It happened in almost every other country in Latin America 3 to 4 times since 1971. And so the more that I found out, the more I just saw that, this thing that seems as so unspiritual, currency devaluation, was having a huge effect on families, individuals. The other thing that I found was even in Uruguay, which is one of the healthier economies in South America, there's very few churches that can afford to pay a pastor anything approaching a living wage. He's got to work at least 2 jobs, 1 or 2 jobs, to then get a small percentage of stuff from his church community. Very few churches can afford buildings because if you can think about this, imagine you've been saving, you've planted a church and you're trying to save up money for even something like 10 years. Your people have been denying themselves and giving sacrificially, and you guys have been trying to save up to be able to do that. On average, since 1971, currencies have failed in Latin America and other countries in the world on average about every 13 years. So imagine you save for 10 years and then the currency fails. And the money that you've been saving you've been denominating, planning, trying to do all these things is literally worthless over the span of a couple months. And so it has tremendously detrimental effect on gospel ministry and the people who are doing it. We saw missionaries all the time while we were there who were having to cycle out to try to go raise more support to try to deal with these issues, even in some place like the United States. And so again, as time went on, I got to experience this and just saw, wow, this really is something that I've never heard I've never heard this raised as a thing that is affecting and having a detrimental impact on global missions. And yet here I am living and seeing this outsized impact. So that's kind of my introduction to these topics. And then Bitcoin, I found out a few years later, was when I had bought a little bit of Bitcoin in 2017 and was just I had no framework for really understanding it. I just saw the shiny bauble that was moving drastically in price, dollar denominated price. And so I just bought a little bit of it and then it died. It went down to like $3,000 from $13,000 and stayed there for a couple of years. And so it wasn't until probably a year and a half later when the price kind of resurrected that me, the philosophy major in college, saw this again, the price fluctuating rapidly, and thought to myself, wait a second, what is going on here? Like I have to understand at least a little bit of not just what is happening, but why this is happening. And so over the course of about, a year, I kind of just went down what is called the Bitcoin rabbit hole, which involves just macroeconomics, involves, Austrian economics, involves a lot of different things. And the shocking thing that I came out the other side with was just that Bitcoin was literally created to deal with and to overcome the obstacles that my Venezuelan brothers and sisters and my Uruguayan brothers and sisters were dealing with and trying to reconcile and trying to figure out how to live with. And so that was kind of the shocking thing for me, was seeing the relationship between those two things. And so again, we can get into some more specifics, but that's kind of where the intersection came. They're nowhere near as far apart and as unrelated as they might initially seem.
Okay, I got a question already, because you guys called me a name earlier, and you want to say it? You guys want to say what it was?
I called you a normie, Gabe.
A normie, right? Because why? Why would you say I'm a normie, Ashua?
Well, because maybe you take the general experience of the American banking system and currency as just accepted, and like that is unquestioned.
Okay.
And the other analogy is the orange pill. So that comes from Matrix, right? You can take the red or blue pill, and you can either stay asleep in your like fantasy world of everything's okay, or you can like wake up and realize that right, there's a whole system that is corrupt and sucking you dry of your lifeblood and energy.
Okay. So I get that. So now, because if there's three people on a podcast, one of them obviously has to be the bad guy. So I can understand. No, but the truth is, you both have experience with Bitcoin. I wish I understood it better. So my first question is, for people like me that are like, I know this is an important conversation, I'm not 100% sure why. Can you explain literally, like for dummies, what is Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's a decentralized digital currency. Would probably be the easiest way to understand it. Again, I could sit here and give a detailed explanation of all how it works, but like at the end of the day, that's really not that important. The thing that really matters and that's unique is that it's a currency that's not issued by a government, and so because it's not issued by a government, it can't be the issuance of it can't be inflated by a government. Right. So again, that's what separates it from these other fiat currencies around the fiat or currencies that are issued by governments that don't have anything backing them. So that's the big difference. It's a scarce currency. It's issued. The supply can't be increased.
Okay, so I kind of can understand where you're coming from on the idea that a decentralized, kind of decoupled from corruption, I suppose, in some ways. Would be helpful for everyone around the world. And I certainly see what you're saying. And I think here's the connect for ministry in the Northwest. If you're somebody who's listening to this going like, okay, how does this apply? I mean, I definitely think figuring out how we can stabilize our own portfolios can help us to thrive in an economy that doesn't support ministry as a vocation. Yeah. I could definitely see that. Yeah. One question I kind of had as you were talking was, well, what about the other side of this for countries that aren't corrupt? Is there any negative implication for economies? If this was to swing way the other way, just throwing that out there. We don't have to talk about it right this second, but that's one of the questions that I have.
So you're asking, like, if a bunch of countries adopted Bitcoin, like, what would that do? You're saying? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, honestly, we've had scarce currencies for most of human history. Like this is the reality is, we're still here. I definitely think we have.
And by scarce currency, you mean like paper certificates linked to rare commodities like gold and silver that limit the amount of money printing that can happen, right? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So scarce currency, either the instruments, the bearer instruments themselves, so the silver or the gold coins or whatever, or again, at bare minimum, you have a paper representation of those things that are in theory, scarce. And I'll get into this a little bit. So why does this matter? Like, why should Christians care about this? Now, again, there's two reasons, two planes of reasons for which Christians should care about anything, right? And so one of them is the vertical plane. So, the great commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Then there's a horizontal plane, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so it's real easy to think about as we think about money, to really just emphasize and really focus on this horizontal plane and think about the practical ways in which money touches the lives of the people we know, ourselves, all this kind of stuff. And that's totally legitimate and good. But the thing that has affected me and the thing that I've become more and more convinced about is to see the horizontal plane and to see the way that this issue of the ethics of money production, how it affects our vertical relationship with God. And so the thing that I would say is, again, have you ever thought, I had never thought about this question, I'd never thought about the question, what does God think about money creation? What does God think about money, and how do we know? The scriptures, obviously, if people who are listening to this are in ministry, the scriptures talk a ton about money. Jesus talks about money a lot. But, does the scripture have any advice, or does it say anything about the principles or something that should govern the ethics of money production? And so, again, initially I thought, no. I was, Bible college educated. I've read the Bible a ton. And so I just had never even thought about this. But one day, as I'd been in Bitcoin for about a year, I was also pastoring our small church in Uruguay. I was doing sermon prep. And I was in the book of Galatians, and in the end of the book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul is talking. He's given final instructions, and he says to them, do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for what a man sows, that will he also reap. And so I'd been thinking about money and then thinking about this context. And so I was like trying to rephrase it in my head. I was like, okay, what is Paul saying? And so effectively what Paul is saying is that God has so fixed this principle of sowing and reaping into the fabric of the universe that to deny it is tantamount to mocking God. And so I started trying to think of what are some examples of this, of places where sowing, this fixed relationship between sowing and reaping could be denied. And so one of the first things that came to mind was in the book of Thessalonians, where Paul says to them, if somebody won't work, then neither shall they eat. Mm. He says there should be a one-to-one relationship between working and eating. And the reason for that, when you think about it, is actually makes sense, because he's saying the point of food is to give you energy to work. And if you're not willing to do work, then you shouldn't receive the energy that this food provides. And so if you take that to a logical extent, if you're not willing to work for long enough, Paul's saying you should die. Like you should die, because if you're not willing to provide for your own needs and work to provide for those around you, you're denying this relationship, this causal relationship that God has designed to exist within the world. You can go through a lot of these things. God will render to each one according to his works. God says you work, and then you get there's consequences of that. You reap according to how you sow. We could
Another
go.
one that comes to mind is let the thief no longer steal,
Yes.
but let him work so he has something to give.
100%.
That's great.
And so again, we could, and there's a bunch more. We could go through what is the difference between Jehovah, Yahweh, and Allah? The difference is that Allah and Muslims have a problem with Jesus. The fact, that with God, like why did Jesus need to die? Because in their understanding of God, Allah can just forgive sins. He doesn't need to have a sacrifice for sins. And so this is, contrasted with Jehovah, who, we have sins, and he sends Jesus to die in our place, to die for our sins. So there has to be a payment. There has to be a payment that corresponds with the sin. And so I just started to see this and look for this in the scriptures, and you start to see it everywhere. And so, logic itself is founded on if this, then this. And so you can't escape that this is how God designed the world to function. But as I started to think about currency and money through this lens, I started to see just the reality of fiat currency that isn't backed by anything and that is issued by governments just based on their willingness to want to do it. And
define the word fiat for us, because that's really telling.
Yeah, so there's a phrase that you might be the way, and maybe you've heard the word fiat before, is fiat lux. It's Latin and it means let there be light. So the first time we hear this as Christians, we hear this in Genesis 1. God says, let there be light. And so fiat currency that's just basically let there be. And
so there be money.
And so now that's a really important example, because who is the only person who can create ex nihilo? It's God. As humans, we can't create ex nihilo. We can only steward the scarce resources that God has given us in the world. And so again, when I started to look at money through this lens, you start to realize, okay, well, what is the advantage of fiat currency? What is the advantage of the fact that a government can create money out of thin air, can create effectively endless amounts of really debt? That's what fiat money is at this point. It's debt. The advantage is that those governments can use that money. They can take it, and again, as we said earlier, they can say, let my kingdom come and let my will be done. They can use this money to bring about whatever kinds of ideas, whatever kind of future and world that they want to bring about. It allows them to actualize their desires. And so I think this is a big deal. Christians throughout church history have recognized that governments, individuals or governments they are not gods. We can't create this way. And the desire to do that is a sinful desire. It's a desire to escape the world that God made and to live in a new world, another world where we are the gods and we can, shape the world according to our own desires.
So just, can I probe on that for one sec?
Yeah.
You're kind of saying wealth creation is evil, or is an evil intent, because it's not even a realistic possibility, because only God could actually create something that has value. We're taking copper and whatever, and we're putting it together. That's our version of that. But what's the difference between fiat currency and Bitcoin shooting up all of a sudden and everybody's rich?
Sure. Yes. So the crucial difference there is the Bitcoin itself is not changing. Mm-hmm. One Bitcoin is one Bitcoin, regardless of the amount of dollars that you can exchange for that Bitcoin. So again, Bitcoin, when the parameters on how Bitcoin is created is different as well. So the actual supply of dollars changes anytime a bank or central bank issues new money.
Right.
And so there's the actual total number of dollars that exists is always perpetually growing. With Bitcoin, there's a fixed cap of 21 million Bitcoin that are hashed or mined. A new amount of them comes into existence. That comes into existence, but is able to be accessed every day, every 10 minutes. And so there will come a point in approximately the year 2140 when the last Bitcoin will be mined. And then there won't be any more Bitcoin to be mined. So it's not like we're out here creating new Bitcoin.
Right.
It's similar to gold, where there's a finite amount of gold in the ground that people go out and find. And someday, theoretically, someday all of the gold will be found, or at least it could be found. Mm-hmm. And so there would be this fixed scarce asset. And so again, the other difference would be, again, it's not that the importance is, again, scarce assets require stewardship. They require a recognition that we aren't God and that we have to say yes to certain things and no to other things. And fiat currency is an attempt to give governments the ability to say yes to everything. Mm-hmm. At all times. And so that's just not the world that we live in. That's not the world that God made. And because it's not the world that God made, the consequences of trying to pretend like we live in that world has been incredibly destructive for individuals, families, and nations.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So like you use this example, the Venezuelan migrants and hyperinflation, and you can hear stories about that. But for most of my life, like the US dollar, we haven't really felt that pressure, right? Yes, there was this '08 crash where if you're into real estate or the stock market, you definitely suffered. But hey, we all got bailed out and everything kind of worked out eventually. And it really hasn't been like until just very recently, like 2020, when we have this inflation that shoots up and all of a sudden everyone notices like, wow, like I'm going to the grocery store and I'm experiencing all this disruption in the economy and life is so much more expensive, right? So we're starting to experience it and it's kind of just ramped up. So I think for the first time in the States, we can kind of relate to that experience. So, but kind of my question, if you can explain this. So I feel like you went down a little bit of this rabbit hole, and it feels like a bit of an armchair theologian or more like an armchair economist kind of conversation. Like, let's philosophically critique the policy of the Federal Reserve Bank and whether it's ethical for them to print money or we should go back to the gold standard, right? And these are really fun conversations that, like, with your college buddies, or you're going to talk and do philosophy, right? Yeah. But then we all have to go back to the real world and buy our groceries and our gas and our Starbucks and fund ministry. And so it feels like, and then there's a lot of, I mean, I complain about 10,000 things in my government, right? And there's all these issues here. Of course, there's corruption with this. And did you hear about this? But we just kind of got to live in it, right? And you just kind of accept it. You suck it up. And every once in a while, there's a candidate that you vote for that you're like, hey, I think this guy might help a little bit. But besides that, you kind of just keep your head down, serve Jesus, help people, and accept that, hey, at least I don't live in like XYZ country where I don't have any freedoms. At least I have freedoms, even though I know, there's corrupt people. But so what do you say to the person that are just like, hey, okay, fine. Like, historically speaking, maybe there's a problem, and like, does Bitcoin actually provide a solution or fix something? It just seems like such a small little thing. Like what can I do today, and how does Bitcoin like change this whole corrupt system? Are you saying that Bitcoin is going to take over the US dollar and the Federal Reserve? Like what's the practical to do based on what you're saying? Yeah.
It's a great question. What I'm not advocating is that everyone goes and, leaves their job and, thinks about Bitcoin full time. I do want to say that generally when I talk about Bitcoin, I do use the exact tone of voice that Asha was using. I decided to make an exception tonight, but I generally do talk very, and I smoke a church warden pipe.
I'm listening. I need like a cough drop or something.
No. But no, it's a great question. Again, what are the practical implications? Why does this matter? One of the things that I tell people all the time is that, again, just the reality, I kind of touched on it a little bit, but the reality that, again, if you are working in gospel ministry, you're doing the most important work in the world. Like you're doing this work that's going to have eternal impact. There are literally souls who are in the balance. And with every day that goes by, governments and central banks are making that work more and more difficult to do. And they're taking away the purchasing power of this money. So what is the stakes? The stakes are that we are, in the United States, again, we have a lot of privilege. There's a fantastic book called Check Your Monetary Privilege that I would highly recommend. Again, there's lots of talk about that topic, that subject, and it's a worthy one to talk about. And this one, this book kind of unpacks how the U.S. the fact that the United States dollar has been the reserve currency has been this privilege that is so incredibly powerful that it just has blinded us to the reality of a lot of the things that are going on in all these other countries around the world. So the reason why it's important is because, to start out with at least, is because, again, we, at the end of the day as Christians, we understand that the chickens come home to roost. You're going to reap what you sow. You can't deny reality forever. And so every country that has tried to go this route of having a currency that is completely disconnected from this process of sowing and reaping ends up devolving into hyperinflation, ends up devolving into all kinds of things. This is, I mean, the big one. You never want to. I can't remember what's the name of the fallacy where you're only ever like 5 moves away from getting to Nazi Germany and Hitler. But one of the things that created the environment that enabled Hitler to rise was the hyperinflation of the German currency. You had people who were desperate. Their money became worthless. And so they became desperate and were willing to follow and listen to people who were making even just, people were promising them the world, even if it meant awful things were going to happen in the meantime. So I think that's one reality is if you're endlessly creating money, then the things that you're trying to purchase with that money are going to go up in value. It's just simple math. It just is you're trading scarce goods. So the food that we eat, your time, your labor, all these things are scarce goods. You only have a fixed amount of them. And this money is effectively limitless. And so you're trying to denominate your scarce life in a currency that's just continuing to grow. And so you get to the point where, again, the situation that we're in, where you have grocery bills that have gone up 20-30% in the last couple of years. You have home prices that have gone up at least 100% in some places. Some places 200% or somewhere around those lines. And why is that happening? It's happening because during COVID, you had at one point, just even in the first year of 2020, or the first year of the pandemic in 2020, 40% of all of the dollars that have ever existed were created to airdrop money to people at home. And so when you're, expanding the monetary supply that quickly, you're effectively have the more or less, way more, almost twice as many, or 50% more dollars competing for more or less the same amount of houses. The only way for that situation to reconcile itself is for the prices of those things to go up, which prices out immigrants, it prices out poor people, it prices out, even increasingly normal people. And so this is a very practical, it's incredibly practical. The difficulty, though, is it does feel hopeless. It does feel like, well, what can I really do about this? And so this is, again, Bitcoin, I'm not trying to present it as some panacea. It's not a panacea. There's plenty of things that it doesn't solve. But one of the things that is valuable about it is that you can begin to denominate your life and to have some sort of savings that can't be devalued based on the whims of a political party and politicians, whether they're left or right or wherever they are. Again, I'm trying to think of some other things. One other thing is that historically, one of the checks on something like endless war has been scarce money. Because one side or both sides end up running out of money to fund the war, and then they have to stop. And so it's this, blessing that brings peace to nations. The fact that you run out of money, fiat currency effectively means, especially when it's these larger countries, that we can fight endless wars, which destroys the lives of people all over the world. It causes more and more things like the immigration that Oshawa and other people are working to deal with. It's this kind of hidden thing that's people just aren't thinking about as it relates to war. We just see war on the television and we're like, oh, that's bad. But a lot of the things that are going on are driven by economic factors. So if you could have a currency that is not, that's not tied to it's the desirability or the power of the currency is not tied to a nuclear power. That changes the incentives of geopolitics. It changes the incentives of lots of things. And so that would be another way in which, this has practical implications. Again, there's lots of debates within the United States about immigration as well. And my perspective on this has changed a lot, having lived in Uruguay and become friends with lots of immigrants who are in very desperate situations. And it's, Bitcoin is one of my favorite things to talk about in this respect, because you have, it seems like on one side of the political discourse, you have the right is more saying we can't do that. We can't just accept an unlimited number of immigrants. Like we just can't do it. It's the math doesn't check out in their right. And then on the other side, the more the left wing side, you have, but these are people. These are image bearers of God. Among the Christians, they said we have to care for these people, and they're right. Like they're making a good point. Like these are image bearers of God. So the question would be, what would be the ideal situation? The ideal situation, the way to solve this would be if the situation in the countries that these people were coming from was better to the point that they didn't want to or didn't need to or didn't have to leave their families to move to another country. That would be the ideal thing. And as crazy as that sounds, that's exactly what's happening in the country of El Salvador with Bitcoin. This country has adopted Bitcoin, and they're seeing the tide of immigration completely reverse.
Wow.
It was overwhelmingly people moving to the States. And now the combination of a president who's been willing to crack down on crime and to, bring safety to people who've endured generations of violence and awful things. He's invited Bitcoin, made Bitcoin legal tender. And so you have companies who are moving in and bringing investment into this country in changing in radical ways that are making it a more inviting place for even El Salvadorians and people from other countries who want to move there. And so, again, these things, they seem pie in the sky. They seem, too good to be true. And there, again, it's not going to fix everything, but it's one tool in the toolbox that we have demonstrable evidence that is changing the tide and fixing the incentive structures in places all over the world.
Yeah, Jordan, I'm getting kind of excited as you're talking because I just did the math and realized that I can today buy 1/100th of a Bitcoin.
Let's go.
And so I'm going to march out and do that as soon as we're done. But no, seriously, I think if it's okay, I would love to just summarize what I think you're saying, like the principles behind it, because maybe there's people listening going like, okay. So I think what you're saying is the law of sowing and reaping. I mean, the chickens are going to come home to roost. I love that. We have to understand that. I think another one is that we should be taking ownership of our finances. And this is, I was trying to make a comparison when you were talking about the American economy and how we've just gotten used to it. It's not that different from somebody going like, Social Security is going to take care of me. I don't have to think about that. Right.
Yes.
And what you're saying is we got to be in this world way more proactive than that about what's going to be our present and our future. And then I think another thing you're saying is we should be taking advantage of a more ethical option. And, I guess one question I have, and I believe Asha probably has more questions is, okay, let's say a brand new church planter just moved to Portland from some Midwest state. And they're like, houses are how much? Wait, we had support in mind. This isn't going to work. Tell us what are the steps you would recommend for somebody that's going, I want to get involved in multiplying the gospel. I want to get involved in this, but I'm being kind of priced out. I mean, what do you think would be steps in the right direction?
It's a fantastic question. And again, this is some of the questions that I'm most excited to talk about and to try to help Christians think about. So Christians, again, as Christians, we're out here ministering in a world where Jesus says, go into all the world and make disciples. He says, they started, it was this group of 12 guys, more than that, but started with this group of 12. They hear this message. They go out and turn the world upside down. Jesus compares them to leaven in working its way through a loaf. And so and that's what we see in the expanse of the gospel is it starts in this small little thing and then it grows over time. And so as I think about gospel ministry, again, God has designed there to be a blessing for self-denial. There's designed there to be a blessing of we deny ourselves and we work and we labor, we don't, we produce more than we consume. We have something to share with those in need. And the issue with another issue with fiat currencies is that through inflation, they penalize people who are saving. They penalize people who aren't immediately going out and consuming and spending whatever money that they make. And so you're just creating a world in which you're rewarded for obeying God and you're incentivized to save and to work more so that you can produce more so that you can save more. I'm like, it's just a healthier world to live in. Again, as it relates directly to church planting, again, this same principle applies. And the example of somebody who's already doing this, the example of somebody who's already doing this is there's a charity called Charity Water. It's founded by this guy, Scott Harrison. He had this crazy story. He grew up in a Christian home. His mom got multiple sclerosis, and she ended up being very sick. He took care of her all throughout high school, graduated high school, and then just basically completely left and, pieced out and went to New York City, became a nightclub promoter, became, really wealthy, partying, sex, drugs, rock and roll, the whole thing. And so he did that for a few years and then woke up one day, realized he's just wasting his life, repented, turned back to the Lord, and then just said, all right, I've wasted so much of my life serving myself. I want to go out and serve other people. So over the course of a couple of years, he traveled to Africa, traveled to a number of different places, and saw there's people who are growing up without water. They have no access to clean water. What can we do about this? Long story short, he starts Charity Water to try to provide clean drinking water. The one thing that's, no one can argue with is this valuable, use of resources and time. So all throughout, the last, I guess they've been around 15, 20 years, something along those lines. From the beginning, he had people, or near the beginning, he had people who were trying to donate, who donated Bitcoin. And so he said, like, Tony Hawk, I think was the first person he got Bitcoin donated like 4 Bitcoin. And they, did the math. I think this was a few years ago. They had people give, I think, something like 400 Bitcoin that was worth around, I can't even remember what it was. At that point, it was like $200 million or, it was like $40 million or something along those lines. And so they did the math based on what the price of Bitcoin was at that point. And they're like, realize we could have helped like 6 times as many people if we would have held that Bitcoin and, just said, all right, we're going to raise X amount of money. We're going to keep it in Bitcoin. It's going to be with a longer term vision. It's still all going to go towards giving people clean water, but we're going to think more generationally, think more long term with this. And so as I think about the ways that Bitcoin can be used to fund a generation of church planters and Christian educational institutions, this is how I'm thinking, is I'm trying to go out there and have this conversation and find Christians who are wanting to make a generational impact and who are recognizing, we've seen how this goes. We've seen the history of how this goes. Let's begin planning now and begin setting aside money in Bitcoin so that we can fund church plants. We can send out church plants who are fully funded, or, at the very least more funded than they would be otherwise for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And so, this Charity Water, what they ended up doing was they found the Winklevoss twins, who are, some of the biggest Bitcoin holders. They basically said, we'll match up to 50 Bitcoin that people give towards Charity Water. And so they ended up having people give something like 52 Bitcoin, 54 Bitcoin. They matched 50. And so for the last 3 years, they've had over 100 Bitcoin sitting in an account. And in another 2 years, they're going to take that and, based on where the price of Bitcoin is today, they're going to be able to help way more people than they would have been able to if they would have immediately liquidated that Bitcoin. So when I think go for it. Yep.
Just one quick perspective related to, let's say, the church planner looking at house prices. And so you could just Google this. So look at the U.S. house price, like the chart denominated in U.S. dollars. And lo and behold, your prices are going up. And if you're trying to save, but house prices in Portland are going up 15, 20, 25% in a year, well, you can't keep up with that.
No.
Because what that actually is, that's not just house prices going up. You look at the other way, that's actually the U.S. dollar going down in value.
Yeah.
If what you want to buy is a house.
Mm-hmm.
But then Google it, U.S. house prices denominated in Bitcoin. And I just pulled up the chart. I don't have an easy way to share it now. But you could see it, and it's like, it's totally different. Maybe, you just Google it. And it's up and it's gone down. And so if I'm saving in Bitcoin and the average compound annual growth rate averaged over 4 to 5 years is around 60 to 80% a year, well, lo and behold, you know what? The house prices are getting cheaper for me.
Yeah.
Everyone else that's denominating in dollars, they're going way up. But if I'm denominating and saving in Bitcoin, and I have a long enough time horizon, so, right, I'm saving for something, let's say I'm giving myself 3-4 years, those houses are getting cheaper, like significantly cheaper.
Yeah.
And the reason is, it's not that it's primarily a speculative asset. Oh, it goes up and down, look at all that, and I'm trying to jump on to the next bandwagon. It's actually because it's a supply-capped scarcity that isn't controlled and printed. And so as simple laws of supply and demand, if demand increases for this asset, the supply is not going to increase. We already know the supply. It's said in mathematics. Mm-hmm. And so what happens when supply stays the same and demand goes up? Only thing changes is the price. Yeah. It's harder to access now. And that's just the simple math behind it. And another just quick analogy that I've used in explaining this is, if you imagine we need money to fund ministry. The book of Ecclesiastes says money answers everything, which is kind of like it's obviously an exaggeration, but in certain ways it's true. Now, if you have a money that's honest, right? So Proverbs says that God delights in just weights and measures, right? Back then they used gold and silver for money, and the way that you knew your money was honest is that your measure, your weight, the weighting was honest. Mm-hmm. You weren't like, oh, this is my little, this is lead, and I put a little extra in here, and so, or I've mixed my gold with another alloy, right? That's how you cheat on your money. And so honest money is money that is tied to sowing and reaping, actually is not stolen. And so when you have an economy and a money printer where they're stealing value out to fund war and government programs and whatever it is, it's like you're running a generator, right? You have a generator and you plug it into your ministry, and it's funding your life, your family, your ministry. And you got to put your work, which is your fuel, into the generator to fund and power the work you're doing. Well, if the generator you're putting in is the US dollar or another currency that is not an honest money, well, there's another cord or like a funnel, kind of a tube, where they're siphoning out the gas on the other end. It's like one of the Looney Tune cartoons where like Wile E. Coyote, he's doing his thing over here, and then the other person is in the back, like pulling it out the other side, and they don't know it, and you just keep putting all their work in, and you don't know that someone's taking it, right? That's the process of that we live under. And this is why life gets harder and harder for everyone. You watch these TikTok videos of these young people talking about, my dad worked one job, right? He was a mechanic, and we had this beautiful house. My mom didn't have to work, and we just had an easy life. And like, now I work, whatever. And they're like weeping on the TikTok videos because they work so hard, and all they get is an apartment, and they're still in debt. And they're like, how did my parents do it? That's actually the generational effects of this system. And so we just think we got to work harder, push harder, push harder. Actually, there's another way. You can just change the generator out. And here's this new generator that's an open source, like an open source protocol currency that doesn't have like a siphon connected to rent seekers that are stealing the value. It actually has its own little thing. It has its own challenges and things you have to learn, and idiosyncrasies. And sometimes you got to punch it a little bit and get it to start. I don't know that's the best analogy, but basically it's a different generator, but it's an honest generator. And it has there's volatility there, but you know what? You're gonna plug it in, and it's actually gonna get easier. It gets more efficient over time, and it powers ministry better and family life better over time. So I don't know, Gabe, if that's helpful.
Dude,
but
that was like awesome, because I mean, anybody that uses Looney Tunes to describe something has my attention, and I got it. Like,
Asha, I just was very impressed with Asha's distraught Zoomer voice. That was, I'm very, very impressed. The other thing,
thinking how interesting it must be to be inside Osha's mind sometimes, because like, where's this stuff coming from?
No, it was spontaneous. Got to tell you the truth.
Yeah. The other thing that I would say is, again, because there's different issues for people. Like there's people who have questions about, the viability in terms of like the good of the environment, like that Bitcoin has, like how is it good for the environment? There's other people who have all kinds of questions, but one of the questions that people have is they feel like I'm priced out of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is already today $50,000 for one Bitcoin. And again, something that I just take for granted a lot of time is like, you can buy $5 worth of Bitcoin. Like you can buy a penny worth of Bitcoin. Like you don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin in order to do it. And again, when people like the issue is that it's difficult for us to wrap our minds around exponential growth, whether it's in our own actions or, anywhere else. It's, it's always difficult to wrap your head around exponential growth. The reality is that today, less than 1% of the world, or right around 1% of the world owns any Bitcoin. There are 55, probably even more now. This is a few months old. So 55, 60 million millionaires in the world. There are only 21 million Bitcoin. So there's only enough Bitcoin. There's not even enough Bitcoin for every millionaire in the world to have one. So if you're sitting there and you're like, I don't even have $50,000. I don't know. That doesn't matter. Like you're still at, when you look at the adoption curve of a different technology or whatever, like we're like just where we're at right now is so ridiculously early. We've heard about it. Some of us have heard about it for 10, 12, 13 years at this point. But again, it still is so weird and new, and people's paradigms for understanding money are just notoriously bad because we've never had any kind of formal education on this. Mm-hmm. Christians have been fantastic and done great work to help people think about and help other Christians think about stewardship of how to use resources and how to use money. How do we be faithful stewards of money? But there's been not a lot of work, especially in the last couple hundred years or last 100 years, done to help explain and to think through what is money. And how does that work and how does it affect our lives? And so I think this is one of those things where, again, the vast majority of people I know who are buying Bitcoin are not millionaires. Like they're normal people who buy a little bit of Bitcoin with every paycheck, maybe $100 or, less than that, $50, whatever. They're treating it like long-term savings. And they're saying, all right, I'm just going to buy a little bit. I'm going to do what I can. Again, I'm going to be faithful steward. I'm going to be a faithful steward of the resources that I have and not just lament the resources that I don't have. And so again, and it's amazing to see what happens when, again, you're faithful over time to, you're faithful in little, it ends up producing a bigger harvest than you would imagine. And so again, this is gross. I'm thinking about Joel Osteen even mentioning these verses. Like we're not trying to say this is a way to get wealthy whatsoever. That's right. The primary thing is not about getting wealthy. Like the point of money is not to make you rich. The point of money is again, to be a one feedback loop that God uses to reward work so that we can provide for his work and provide for the needs of those people around us.
So good. Oh my gosh. That's a great perspective there. And we all really appreciate Jordan taking time with us to share this very unique kind of out of left field topic for this podcast, but very relevant when you think about where, our whole world is going. We're feeling the pinch, as Joshua mentioned, I think in Portland, as well as the Northwest, but as well as the rest of the country. And I think we all got to start thinking about, okay, there might be some shifts needed. And so thank you for helping us to think intelligently about it. Two questions I have. One, what is like a starter resources? You mentioned this book, Check Your Monetary Privilege. Is what's the best? Like you go to me, a normie. What should I read? What should I listen to? What should I watch?
Do you have it, Ash? Oh, okay, yeah. So the book that Ash was holding.
I do have the other one too, but this one's got Jordan's face on there too.
There we go.
Jordan's face.
Where is he? He's around here. There he is.
There you go. If you're just on the audio, so that he's holding up. So I was one of the authors of a book called "Thank God for Bitcoin." The creation, corruption, and redemption of money. Contrary to what you might think, but we talk about Bitcoin in the last 2 chapters. The vast majority of the book is just unpacking at like a 9th grade level this issue of the ethics of money production and looking at the ways that money affects our lives. So again, a lot of what I talked about today is touched on in there and expanded in a little bit of detail. Again, it's designed to be an introductory resource to people who've never thought about this issue at all. So I would recommend that resource. There's another, if you're more of a, if you're a pastor and you're like, all right, I want some of the meat, that's good, a good milk resource. And, that's good. If you want another resource that doesn't even mention Bitcoin, that kind of unpacks, that was written based on the work of a 15th century bishop whose name was Nicholas Oresme. There's a fantastic book. I can't recommend it enough. It's called The Ethics of Money Production by Jörg Guido Hulsmann. It's a great book that kind of gets into all of the not intuitive, moral, ethical, theological issues that are in play with something like the creation of money, the ethics of money production. So I'd recommend either one of those books. And then again, there's a number of of other Bitcoin books you could go to. There's one called the Bitcoin Standard. That's kind of like the magnum opus. Don't start there. You'll get overwhelmed.
Okay.
But yeah, there's a bunch of them. But those, I would say those two are two good places to start.
Very cool. And then, how can people get in touch with you, follow you if they'd like to be more connected?
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. You can find me on Twitter at JM Bush Writes, WRITES. You can also find more about TGFB at tgfb.com. And then the big thing that we have, actually, I'll be in the Pacific Northwest. I'll be in Portland. Is it May, Ash? When is it?
I thought it was April. Yeah, you keep talking. I'll
April
I'll
or May, something.
Tell them about Nashville too.
Yes, yeah. So there's going to be a Portland Bitcoin meetup or something that is going to be doing like a 1-day event that I'm gonna fly out for, and then TGFB does a couple events every year. Our big event this year is going to be a 2-day conference out in Nashville. It's going to be. It looks like we're going to be in Rocket Town on July 24th and 25th. So we're going to have a bunch of surprising people come out, including we are excited to welcome Portland's own Pastor Thomas Terry. Is going to be speaking and helping. So, there's going to be a good number of people who are going to be coming out there. We'd love to have you, love to welcome you. And we're also good. If you can't make it there, we're going to do a streaming option as well. So,
cool.
So that would be the best ways to go.
So May 22nd is the conference called Bitcoin is for Everyone. And it's, it'll be at a local McMinimans and just kind of a 1-day education event. So both Jordan and I will be speaking at that, either doing a main session or a breakout as Bitcoin relates to like human flourishing.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, you guys, what an enriching conversation. And I hope this has been helpful to everybody watching and listening. And again, Jordan, thank you so much.
No, grateful for you guys. Thank you for your time. And to the audience, thank you for your work in the Pacific Northwest. And again, may the Lord bless you and continue to help you on your way.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.